Hey everybody, welcome to the Asian Boss Podcast. I'm your host Stephen Park, and the following is a conversation with Konstantin Kisin. Konstantin is a Russia-British author, comedian, and a social commentator who recently went viral for his speech at Oxford University. The cultural gap between Asia and the West is vast, and while we try our best to bring you the most authentic insights and perspectives from Asia, the reality is that most people living in Asia are completely in the dark about the latest cultural shifts taking place in the West, other than, of course, what they hear from the Western mainstream media. Whether it be about the Russian invasion of Ukraine or fighting the so-called woke culture in the UK and the US, Konstantin has you covered with his brilliant yet super straightforward takes. So how does one go from living in the former Soviet Union to giving a viral speech at Oxford? Let's find out. Hey Konstantin, how you doing?
Hey man, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm so impressed with everything you've built over there at Asian Boss. Looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I know you're a very famous man these days, starting with that viral Oxford University speech that has millions of views. What does it feel like to be sort of the man of the moment?
You should be honest with your audience and say that you're massively exaggerating, because I think the reason you see me a lot is you're probably on the internet a lot. But I walk around here in the UK. Generally, most people, thankfully, don't know who I am. So you're right. My Oxford speech about woke culture and climate change, it probably did about somewhere between 100 and 200 million views, which is a lot. It is incredible that many people wanted to watch it. But you know, it's interesting because we live in a world now, I think you're not really going to have that many like global celebrities or superstars anymore, because everyone is like in their niche, and so you can be very famous within a certain sliver of society and be completely unknown in the rest of it, which is my dream. I never wanted to be famous. I don't want that for my family. I don't want that for myself. I want to be able to walk down the street and most people not know who I am. So I'm really enjoying not being as famous as you think I am.
A bit of a context is that we are normally known as the outlet or the platform where we deliver the most authentic perspectives and insights from Asia to the global audience. But one of our mission statements is actually to bring people's voices and cultures together. And that includes bridging social and cultural gaps between Asia and the West. And as you know, it's like in the current climate, everything just becomes so divided and polarized, and you know, as far as like the cultural gap, it just seems so vast. Pretty much the only media outlet that we have to rely on, even for the Asian audience wanting to learn more about what's happening in the UK and America, is what? BBC, CNN, Fox. That's pretty much about it, right? And so, especially for regular people like me and other people out there, they just want to hear some authentic perspectives. And you know, you have a very interesting background, which we can go more into, is that you actually have a Russian background. And you know, maybe one of the fun street interview topics that we were thinking of doing is going to Russia and say, hey, do you think that Russia is part of Asia? It'll be very interesting to hear about how you grew up, what you're reading of the current state of the Western society.
Well, it's fascinating that you talk about whether, you know, Russia is Asia, because obviously a big part of Russia is Asia and some of it is Europe. So together it's definitely part of Asia for sure. And I actually, you know, I wasn't born in Russia. I was born in a country that no longer exists, the Soviet Union. And I lived in many different parts of it, including in Uzbekistan, which is Central Asia. In the UK, it's funny because actually in the UK, when they say Asian, what they mean is Indian subcontinent, which is hilarious to me. And also they group them into one, and they're like, oh, the Asian community think this. And I'm like, well, Pakistan and India, who are about to have a nuclear war, they're the same. Are you kidding me? So we're very ignorant in the West, because I think we can afford to be. And also, I think you're right as well, that I think probably if you're just watching CNN and BBC and Fox News, you probably don't get an accurate picture of what's happening in the West.
How do you go from, you know, being someone who couldn't probably speak English when you were even like 9 or 10, and then how do you go from that to being an exceptionally well-read and somebody who's obviously very well informed, and you're now giving speeches at like Oxford and just making all these media appearances. How did you grow up?
I was born in Moscow, and for the first 4 years of my life, I lived there. Then my family moved to Tashkent in Uzbekistan, which was still part of the Soviet Union. I lived there for a few years. Then moved back to Moscow, and around this time, the Soviet Union was collapsing. It was a crazy time in which many people lost everything that they had, and it was a very turbulent and unstable period of time. But it was also a time of opportunity, and my father, being a young guy at the time, very clever guy, him and a few friends started a small business, and then that business became bigger, and then became bigger and became bigger, and before they knew it, they were, they owned Russia's first bank. That's the kind of crazy world that they lived in at the time, or one of Russia's first banks. And so there was a very short period in my family's history when my family had quite a lot of money. And then in about 1996, 95, 96, this is when Boris Yeltsin was president, before Vladimir Putin. My father was actually a junior minister in Boris Yeltsin's cabinet. He was a minister in the government. And due to the way that Russian politics worked at the time, he was falsely accused of a bunch of things, and he had to flee Russia under false identity. And it was only recently that he was cleared of all these completely false charges, and now is able to travel to Russia and so on. In the interim, there was a short period of my family history when they had money, and so they sent me to boarding school in England. And I arrived, as you say, speaking very little English. But it's the sort of environment where it's like being thrown into the lake, and you either swim or you don't, and it's sink or swim. I learned to swim pretty quickly. I picked up the English as quickly as I could. And then, I had more difficulties in my life. I went to university, and by the time I got to university, my family really had no money at all. So there was no way I was going to be able to finish my degree. And that meant that I had, by this time my wife and I already got together. So I had to start to find a way to provide for my family, basically. And the only skills that I really had is I spoke 2 languages pretty well. And so I started a translation business. I became a freelance translator, translating documents and all sorts of, banking documentation and Vladimir Putin's speeches and computer games that I used to play. That's one of the cool things that I ever got to do. Actually, one of my favorite ever computer games, I was one of the team that translated it into English because it was made in Ukraine.
Is it possible for you to travel to Russia and see what it's like? I mean, not obviously since the whole Russia-Ukraine war started, but you of all people actually understand what it's like to live in a society where you don't technically have the freedom of speech. But for people who might not appreciate that, what's it like? So what can you not say in Russia?
Well, right now, you mentioned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which they call a special military operation, if you call it a war, you can be prosecuted and put into prison for 10 to 15 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And one of the insane things that was happening, particularly earlier on, because there was a big eruption of protest early on, of course, and concern about the war, people went out to protest with placards, with signs. They would say peace or for peace or I want peace or whatever. And these people would be arrested and taken away. So then people started to go out on their own, because if you protest with other people, this is like a protest and that's illegal. So if you go on your own, it's called a single man picket. You're allowed to do that. So they would go out, they would get arrested, right? If they had a sign. So then some people started going out on their own and having no sign, they just pretend to have a sign, and they would get arrested as well.
Is this something that you've actually witnessed, or is it showing in some media outlets or something?
Yeah, so I can't go to Russia right now because I'd get arrested straight away. But I have friends and family in Russia who live there who are sending me all this footage, and these are genuinely things that were happening. The funniest thing that I ever heard about this was there's a Russian, it's not a Russian name, it's one of the ethnic groups within Russia called, and the name is Zamir. And in Russia, Mir means peace, right? And Za means for. So his name literally means in the Russian language, for peace. And he arrived at an airport, and you know how when you arrive at an airport, taxi drivers will sometimes have a sign with your name. So This dude had the sign on, and he nearly got arrested. The police came and they were like, what are you doing? That's the level of paranoia that it got to because of the war. And growing up in the Soviet Union, it was really weird because there was several types of truth that we had. There was the public truth, what you would say in public if you were to be asked your opinion about something. Then there was what you might say with your friends, and then there was what you would say around the kitchen table.
Right.
And people who lived in the Soviet Union, I imagine it's the same in North Korea. They got used to knowing what they're supposed to think in different contexts. So you literally had different realities depending on where you were. And so right now, for example, the truth is nobody really knows what public opinion is of the war in Russia, because if you have official polling that says 80% of people in Russia support Vladimir Putin, it could be true. It could well be true that that's the case. But I also know that around the kitchen table, people have their own conversations that never become public. And so if someone walks up to you in the street, like, what do you think about the war? They know it's on camera. They're not going to give you an honest answer. And so, the example I always give, Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator, towards the end of the Cold War, he had a 95% approval rating the day before he was arrested and summarily executed. So in that kind of society, you don't really know the exact nature of public opinion, what people feel, what they think, why they're going along with certain things, because everybody has their own private reality and the public reality because they know what they're supposed to say. And it's a weird experience to grow up in. I don't imagine in a free country like South Korea you really have that.
Having lived in those quote-unquote authoritarian regimes, what would be sort of your ideal image of the West? It's like, our environment is like we have this multiple levels of truth, but man, only if we were in America or in other free countries, then we could say whatever we want to say. I mean, what was sort of like your perception of the West?
Well, you hit it on the head. I mean, at the time when I was growing up in Russia, we were all taught that the West is evil. And, these capitalist bourgeois, evil people. My family were not big fans of the Soviet regime, but even they bought into the propaganda that the West is evil and whatever. And it was only really when they could go. Yeah. So I give you an example. My mother, she grew up on the very border with Finland. This is northwest Russia. And her family, like I say, they were not huge fans of the regime, but she remembers as a girl, like going to the border with Finland and like going, screw you Finns, because that's what the kids were all taught. But to me, what I learned when I was growing up in the West was that the difference is that this is a society where you're supposed to be able to have your own opinion and people don't bother you. Like we have a joke in Russia, why can't you have sex in Red Square? Is because you'd get too much advice from the passers-by. Because everyone is up in your business. Everyone is telling you, you're supposed to do this. And it's not just Russia. Ukraine is the same in many other parts of the former Soviet Union. It's just part of the culture. There's a more kind of community vibe. Like I remember my wife and I were walking in like early spring somewhere in Ukraine. I don't remember the city. I think it was actually in Lviv in Western Ukraine. And she had flip-flops on. And she went into a shop and I was standing outside because I didn't want to go into yet another shop with her. So I was standing outside and this woman came up to me and she said, "Excuse me, is your wife, is she okay with the flip-flops? Because tell her she might get cold." Like everybody's up in your business all the time. It's this kind of, and look, it has many positive aspects because people are looking out for each other, you could argue. But in England in particular, like no one is, you could be walking along almost naked in freezing winter and nobody would even, everyone pretend that it's not happening. That's kind of how it is. America's a bit different. What I learned when I went to America first couple of times is people are very respectful of your distance, but if they feel like you need some help, you're standing in a queue and you're discussing, that thing that's on the menu, is that this or that? Like people will chip in and they will give you advice. So it's kind of halfway between the two cultures. But generally speaking, the thing I always really appreciated about the West was the idea that you are free to live your life the way you want. As long as you are respectful of the law and you are not interfering in other people's lives, live your life how you want, right? Do whatever you want with your life as long as you're not hurting other people. And to me, that is a very important principle, actually, because coming from a society where you were told what to think, you were told how to behave, you were told what you're supposed to think and not supposed to think, etc. But as I say, no one really knows, not even people, I can call up someone in Russia now and say, what's going on? What do people think? And they wouldn't know, because you don't really know what's going on in people's private homes and their private opinions. So it's very hard to judge.
So if we're talking about, since we're on the topic of the war, it doesn't seem to be anywhere close to, how is this going to play out?
The Russian mindset when it comes to leadership is you got to understand, Russia has never had a single democratic transition of power. People don't expect to have democracy. And the Russian attitude to the leader, whether it was the Tsar or the secretary of the general secretary of the Communist Party, or now president, no one expects these people to really be accountable democratically. The leader of the country is seen in Russia to this day, somewhat as being anointed from above. They are appointed by God, really. And if you have a good leader, then you are blessed. And if you have a bad leader, it's something to endure. And so things like war, they're not really seen as, we elected the wrong guy and now he's done the wrong thing, and at the next election we have an opportunity to change that. It's seen more as, well, this is a period of time when we have this strong leader in Vladimir Putin who stabilized the country in the 90s. He genuinely has a lot of credit in the bank with ordinary Russians because he stabilized the country after the chaos that we saw. And now, well, look, war has come, we have to endure. That will be a lot of the mentality around that. Whether people are happy about it, again, as I say, that's really something that's very difficult to gauge. But of course, the longer the war goes on, the more war fatigue there will be. We saw this this is a big part of why the Soviet Union started to go downhill, is involvement in places like Afghanistan, where you saw that Russia or the Soviet Union wasn't achieving its goals, but there were a lot of people who were suffering as a result of being involved. And the scale of the war in Russia, the war in Ukraine rather, now is such that a lot of casualties, a lot of chaos going on. The Russian troops are not very well supplied. So the message is getting back that rather than being this triumphant war effort, actually Russian soldiers, as they've always been, are being thrown into the meat grinder without being properly supported, led by idiot generals, etc. This is kind of the narrative now, including from people who support the war and who actually want the war to be more aggressive. They are now very upset about what's happening because they're seeing that the Russian soldiers don't have enough ammunition, the artillery isn't as effective because they have a shortage of shells and so on. In terms of how it plays out, nobody really knows, because the moment we're recording this late March, what we're waiting for is that part of the world, Eastern Europe, during late spring is, they call it Rasputitsa, which is when there's a lot of rain and there's a lot of mud, and that means that you can't really attack effectively with tanks and armored personnel carriers, etc. So what has been happening in recent months is Russia has been throwing everything it has at this tiny little town called Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, and they've been throwing a lot of infantry at it in these frontal assaults against fortified Ukrainian positions. Both sides are taking very heavy casualties. And I think the reason that it's happening isn't so much that this is some kind of great military strategy, but rather it's a political idea, which is we need to free up as much of these two eastern regions that they call it Donbass. And if we can be seen to have liberated them, at least we have something to sell to our people. They haven't been as successful in that as they would have wished. And now what we have to see is what happens in April, because there will be almost certainly, both sides are talking about it. The Ukrainians have spent this time training up large forces in the West, in Britain and other places, using Western tanks and armored personnel carriers and other equipment. And the purpose of that, as I understand it, is to have a counteroffensive once this mud season is over, in order to see if they can take back some of their territory. And I think Everything now depends on how that goes. Will the Ukrainians be able to be effective in pushing Russian forces further out? If you remember, at the beginning of the war, Russia almost had control of the entirety of eastern and central Ukraine, everything to the east of the central line. Ukrainians succeeded in pushing them out of almost all of that, and now it remains to be seen whether the counteroffensive is going to be successful. And that's when I think you're going to see how the next stage of that unfolds.
You know, you must be put in this unique position that people almost like come to you for advice when it comes to what's really happening. We can only rely on the mainstream media from the West. So maybe they say that, oh, Russia's almost done, but we were just wondering, is that actually true?
No, Russia's not almost done. No, and this is what people should be clear about. Look, I've been very clear in that my own view is Russia was wrong to invade. I think what Russia is doing there is immoral. No doubt a huge number of war crimes have been committed. We actually had a guy on our show, an interview we haven't released, he's more of like a trauma guy. He works with that, and he was over in Ukraine, and he talks about, you know, the amount of sexual violence that was committed against the civilian population by Russian troops is just off the charts. And so, you know, what Russia is doing is terrible, but that does not mean that we should engage in some kind of wishful thinking and pretend, you know, Russia is on the brink of collapse. That's not true. Russia historically has a tremendous ability to absorb casualties. Historically, Russia is able to absorb huge numbers of its soldiers being killed and maimed without really having much domestic unrest. And that is for the reasons that we talked about earlier, which is, you know, war, well, you know, we just got to tolerate it, we got to endure it. The ability to suffer is almost like a Russian superpower in some ways, sadly. I don't know if you're aware of this period of Russian history, but just before the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany in June 1941, actually the Soviet Union had been fighting what they call the Winter War with Finland. And this was a war in which the Soviet Union invaded Finland, a tiny country. My great-grandfather actually fought in that war on the Soviet side. And they took hundreds of thousands of casualties for this tiny little country because the Finns fought so bravely. Actually, the sniper, they call him the White Death, the sniper in the entire history of military conflict, who has the highest kill count, is this Finnish guy who I think didn't even have optics. He had iron sights on his crappy little wooden rifle. And he's responsible for like hundreds and hundreds of enemy kills. And so that war was a war in which the Soviet Union had huge numbers of casualties, but still was able to get some kind of victory, you could say, in that Finland had to give up part of its territory. But what they did do is they achieved sovereignty and independence, and Finland is still an independent country to this day, as you know. And I think that will almost certainly be, and I've been saying this from day one, at least in the best case scenario for Ukraine, what happens with them. They need to defend their country, defend their territory to a point where Russia basically gets tired of fighting. And at that point, they can say, look, you've taken Crimea, and Crimea is very important to Russia for strategic reasons because it's their way of projecting naval power into the Black Sea. It's very, very important to Russia. I don't think they would give it up for almost anything. You know, Ukraine is in the middle of a war effort, right? When you're fighting a war, you have to go, we're going to get our land back. Everything is Ukraine. We have to fight. And I understand that. And I was speaking to somebody the other day who literally, this guy who's like an IT consultant. He's not some guy who's, you know, got huge muscles or whatever. He's just a normal guy, drove his family to the border with Poland, dropped them off, kissed his daughters, kissed his wife, waved goodbye, and went to the front line, right? This is what ordinary Ukrainians are doing. They're standing up for their country. They're saying, you know, family, you go, you be safe. I'm going to go to the front line to defend my country. That's what's happening. And I think that's what they need to do. And of course, because of that, the narrative in Ukraine now is, you know, we're going to get everything back and whatever. But I think the truth of it is, long term, the likely outcome will be they have to concede some territory. But what they need to get in exchange is long-term security. And that means membership of NATO. Or I'm afraid to say, you know, speaking to you, I understand the trauma for the Korean people of the split between South Korea and North Korea and having this DMZ in the middle and all of the terrible things that come with that, families being split and all of that. That may be one of the ways that this ends up, is some kind of protection for Ukraine, so that at least they can't be invaded again. That's what they need, because if we have what we had in 2014, which is, okay, you know, let Russia have some more land, it will just come back again, and this will never be resolved.
In your opinion, what is the likelihood that we'll achieve that sort of a compromise without, you know, Russia just resorting to nukes?
It's very important, before I say what I'm about to say, that we all recognize that we have not been as close to a nuclear conflict as we are now for a very long time.
Yeah.
I think we should all acknowledge that, right? Because you see in the Black Sea, Russian jets bumping into American drones and crashing them into the ocean. I don't know if you would have followed this, but to a large extent, they don't even bother reporting this in the mainstream media anymore. It's very common now for American and Russian jets to fly next to each other and give each other the finger, like in Top Gun.
Really?
Yeah, this is happening all the time. Russian naval ship, some kind of destroyer, I think, chased off an American submarine from the coast of Japan recently. Like, all of this is happening all the time. So we are not in a good place as the world. We are closer to nuclear conflict than we have been for a long time. That does not mean we're close to nuclear conflict, right? This is an important distinction, and this nuance sometimes get lost. People think that, you know, if we're even a tiny little bit closer, that means we should do everything possible to immediately alleviate this. And of course, we don't want to be going down that path. On the other hand, do you allow countries with nuclear weapons to invade whoever they want? Because that, to me, does not set a good precedent, right?
Right.
And so there is always this trade-off of how do we manage this carefully. Now, from my perspective, as I look at Russia now, what is being said in Russia now, what people are doing in Russia now, the way that Putin is talking about things, I actually think they have dialed back the nuclear rhetoric a lot since the war started. Initially, what I think they were worried about is NATO actually getting physically involved. And so Putin was always saying, you know, we will defend ourselves with any means necessary and whatever. He kept talking about the nuclear thing. Doesn't really talk about it now. And I think one of the reasons is using nuclear weapons for Russia would be a complete dead end, and would actually be terrible, first of all, for them, from many different perspectives. Number one, we see that Russia, you know, has some help from China at the moment. China would not go along with Russia using nuclear weapons. That they wouldn't remain allies with Russia. India has been kind of neutral. India wouldn't be neutral if a country was dropping nukes all over the place, right? The response from the Western allies of Ukraine and the Western international community would be so much stronger than it has been if Russia used nuclear weapons. And of course, from a narrative perspective, if your entire narrative is Ukraine is Russia, these are Russian people, we must liberate them. Well, if that's your narrative, why are you then dropping nukes on them?
Right.
That doesn't make any sense. And so from a purely strategic perspective, it makes absolutely no sense for Russia to be using nuclear weapons. It would be a complete dead end. I think they know it. And so a lot of the rhetoric is simply about attempting to scare people in the West in terms of providing support. But we have seen, if you look at the actual trajectory of the last year, you know, people said, well, we can't give the Ukrainians heavy weapons. We can't give them artillery. Well, then they gave them a bit of artillery, Russia did nothing. So they gave them more artillery, Russia did nothing. Then they were like, well, we can't possibly give them anti-missile systems so they can defend themselves from Russian missile attacks, right? That would be escalation. They gave them missiles. What happened? Nothing. Then they said, we can't give them armored personnel carriers. That would be too much. Now they have armored personnel carriers. Then we're like, we can't give them tanks. Now the Ukrainians are training with Abrams tanks and Challenger 2 tanks and Leopard 2 tanks from Germany, and they are about to be deployed in the conflict. You know, there are people who feel the West shouldn't be involved. There are people who feel the West should have been involved more and earlier. I actually think, generally speaking, the West has played it about right, in that we give a little bit and we see what happens. We give a little bit, and so Russia never can say, oh, now you've gone too far, because it's like, what? We gave them 20 armored personnel carriers and that's your red line? That's a bit. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think people are right to be concerned that Russia and the United States are in a more hostile posture towards each other than they've been for a long time. However, we have to recognize that that is not just down to us. Russia has a part to play in this. We can't control this to a large extent, and you can't allow a country to use its nuclear arsenal to bully the entire world into allowing them to invade other countries. That's where we are from my perspective. I don't think it's in Russia's interest or in Putin's interest to be using nuclear weapons. I don't think he would do unless his life was personally in danger. But the reason we should still be concerned about it is, you know, escalation isn't all about, you know, people sat down and planned stuff. You know, someone shoots out a drone, someone gets pissed off, a Russian jet gets, crashes because it's crashed into a drone. The pilot dies, and suddenly we've got ourselves an international incident, and things can spiral out of control. So we've got to be very careful about things like that. And I think, you know, screaming and shouting about how the West needs to be more involved, we actually need to dial down the rhetoric and just on the lowdown continue to provide the Ukrainians with what they need to push Russian forces out of Ukraine. I think that would be a much smarter way of doing it, instead of running around bragging how many weapons we've given them and, you know, how much we've escalated the situation.
What's going to be the impact of this on the UK economy? Because I know that you guys are, you know, things are difficult with inflation and you know, gas prices, and what's the public sentiment in the UK regarding the situation in Russia and Ukraine?
Well, the public sentiment in the UK is overwhelmingly supportive of our efforts to help Ukraine. If you look online, you might not get that impression, but generally speaking, if you ask the ordinary person, they're very much on board with continuing to help the Ukrainians. The economic impact of that hasn't been major, actually, because we had a very mild winter and gas prices are now starting to fall again. And the problems that we have are much more likely to be economic problems of our own making. It's one of the things I talked about in my Oxford speech about our obsession with net zero and the fact that we keep printing money and all that. I don't know what the situation is in your part of the world with that. Perhaps you're probably bought into the same idea that, you know, we can just keep printing money forever and everything will be fine.
It was just so stupid, but that's what they do. They just keep printing money.
And yeah. I'm not an economic expert, but I just have this very simple idea, which is there's no such thing as a free lunch. And you cannot continue to borrow from your grandchildren indefinitely before you start to get problems, right? So I think our concerns economically are much more of that nature than it is anything to do with the war in Ukraine. And of course, the other thing is, you know, the pandemic showed us that while it was economically, globalization was a good idea because we could have things made cheaply in China and shipped over here. We did find out, though, that, you know, when the shit hits the fan, you know, China is going to act in its own self-interest, and it's going to, you know, make sure they've got the PPE and they've got the antibiotics and they've got the things they need before we get them. And so this also applies to energy. If you make yourself dependent on cheap Russian gas instead of using your own energy that you do actually have, this is the thing that I don't understand. It's like we pretend to be green in the West by outsourcing energy production and steel making and all these other things to other countries where they're made to a lesser industrially robust standard than they would be in the UK, so we can pretend to be green. And then suddenly Europeans like the Germans, who were warned about this, even by Donald Trump, who many people dislike, but he was right on this. He said, look, if you continue to get into bed with Russia, they will use it against you. And guess what happened? That's exactly what happened, right? So making yourself dependent on countries which, you know, we don't have to think of the Chinese or the Russians as our enemies, but we have to recognize that they have different interests to us, strategically speaking, right? And so if you make yourselves overly dependent on them, they then have the opportunity to use that against you, or you'll be vulnerable. And we saw this during the pandemic. So there's a whole deglobalization process going on, where I think that will have the biggest impact on our economies more than anything else, because globalization, it had many negative impacts on certain groups of people in certain parts of our countries. But broadly speaking, it did make the world a lot richer. It just did, because we were able to trade and work together. That period of time seems to me to be kind of partly over. And I think the economic problems we're going to be facing, the war in Ukraine is going to be a very small part of that, actually.
Speaking of the pandemic, I mean, we did hear from this part of the world how UK had this like strict lockdown policy where, you know, you show footage of just like nobody on the street. And I'm pretty sure there were a lot of repercussions as a result of that. And I mean, God forbid if we experience another pandemic, everybody's not, they're not in agreement or in sync as to what is the right protocol to follow, whether it be regarding masks or lockdowns. So I just feel like things just get more and more chaotic because now we don't know who to trust or what to trust.
I don't know what your views on this are, or you know what the situation was over there, but in the UK, I certainly felt that and by the way, these aren't my words. These are the words of one of the scientists responsible, a guy called Neil Ferguson. He said, we didn't think lockdowns were possible until the Chinese did them. And I'm kind of going, well, is that who we want to model ourselves on? Because no offense to China, but they have a different culture and a different way of doing things. And if I wanted to live under the Chinese Communist Party and their way of doing things, I'd go and live in China. And I thought when I came to Britain that that's not what I was signing up for. And so there were several things that concerned me about the pandemic response we had in this country. Number one, I supported the first lockdown, which, as you say, was very strict, but we were told it's for 3 weeks. And I was like, look, I can stay at home for 3 weeks. I work too hard. I'm going to spend a bit of time with my wife. You know, this is a dangerous pandemic. We don't know what the hell is going on. If elderly people are going to be protected by the fact that I go out for a walk once a day, I'm a responsible citizen. I'm happy to do that for a few weeks. That's a reasonable thing of a government to ask its citizens to do. And at the time, with the information that we had, that is, to me, an absolutely legitimate point of view. However, you know, fast forward and 2 years later, we know that this isn't the plague. We know that the people who are vulnerable to it is a small sliver of the population, mostly elderly and people who are overweight and people who have other preconditions, who we could protect as a targeted group instead of shutting down the entirety of our society. And it was becoming increasingly clear that having those sorts of restrictions for a very long time was going to have a tremendous negative impact on society, on children's education, on children's mental well-being, on physical health, on cancer diagnosis, and all sorts of things. And over that period of time, I went from, the government saying we need to shut down for 3 weeks. Okay, I'm prepared to put up with that, to like, this is way out of line and this is ridiculous. And I'll be honest with you, there was a minority of people who felt the way I did, but the thing that scared me the most is the public became authoritarian, or they were authoritarian, and the authoritarianism was revealed. Most people they supported all of this. I mean, polls are not necessarily reliable, but some of the polling we saw in the UK, I mean, you'll laugh at this, I imagine, but there were people who said 20% of the public said we should shut down all nightclubs forever, even if there's no COVID.
Okay.
We should make people wear masks on public transport forever, even if there's no COVID. Healthy people wearing masks. That was something like 20% as well. So a lot of people, and let me use technical language, lost the fucking plot. They lost the fucking plot. They were so scared because of government propaganda, because the government didn't tell them the truth, which is this is a very serious disease for some people. This is a very serious disease for people who are vulnerable to this disease. Let's focus on protecting those people, right? I would fully support that. And there were Nobel Prize winning scientists and people like Jay Bhattacharya and many others who said we need targeted protection. We need focused protection. Let's look after the people who need it and not shut down our entire economy and not imprison people in their homes for 2 years. However, a lot of the public was so terrified by government messaging about this that they were just like, do whatever, just do something. And we don't care about civil liberties. We don't care about freedoms. And then They didn't care about free speech either, because they started to censor the very scientists who were saying these things. They tried to smear them. They said these people were irresponsible, to the point where, look, I think one of the most crucial questions about this, since we're talking about the Asian dimension of this, is where exactly did COVID come from? And this isn't, to say, it came from a lab in Wuhan and the Chinese must be made to suffer for this. No, but we need to know. I mean, this is a pandemic that killed millions of people. And as you say, there could be more pandemics. And many pandemics have come out of that part of the world because it's very densely populated. What happened? Don't we think that we should find out about that? And yet, if you said 2 years ago, this virus came from a lab in China, you'd be censored. Scientists would be censored, right? So there's a lot of very strange things that happened during the pandemic that worry me, and I don't think that we learned the lessons from them at all.
Yeah, exactly. So if we didn't learn our lesson this time, what's going to happen pretty much for the next one, right?
Absolutely,
Even when I interviewed the leading infectious disease expert from Korea who advised presidents, and he was the one handling SARS and MERS and all that type of infectious disease. Even he started from a position of it's highly unlikely that it leaked from a lab, to later saying, look, the longer this drags on and they cannot identify the intermediary host, it is possible. And he even himself was admitting to the possibility.
And that's how science works, isn't it? I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is a really important point, is science is the process of testing out different hypotheses about what may be true. And you can't do that if some hypotheses are going to be banned on the internet.
Exactly. So what I was getting at is that by talking to this person, then you're allowed to ask questions. It doesn't make sense to me why that type of conversation would be censored in, I suppose, Western media or in Western society. This sort of leads nicely into the issue of censorship. I do get the sense that a lot of honest conversations are being censored. Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah, you are. And look, by the way, one of the things that people seem to have forgotten, and this used to be a very well understood thing. I think it was it Thomas Jefferson who said that he who sacrifices liberty for safety will get neither and deserve neither, right? He said it better than that. But the point is, people have forgotten that freedom has a cost. There's no question about that, right? If you are in a free society, that means that some people are going to do and say things that you don't like. And that is the price that until recently Western societies were prepared to pay. But now we've got to the idea that we must get as much safety as we possibly can, and freedom can be thrown onto the altar of that. And I just don't buy that argument at all, because look at what happened with the pandemic itself. People thought, you know what, we're in a pandemic, we can't have misinformation, we can't have people who have a different take of it. And of course, you got to remember, there were a lot of people who were spouting absolute crap. People who were saying, COVID is caused by 5G and all of this other nonsense, right? However, the price you pay for scientists being able to do proper research and have proper conversations and get somewhere is that you're going to get some idiots on the internet talking about things that they don't understand. That is the trade-off. And to me, that trade-off is worth it. But people seem to have got this idea that safety has no trade-offs, that you can be super safe and you're not going to pay a price in terms of your freedoms for that. And I remember I was, as I mentioned, on Question Time recently, and they do a question that is off camera to warm up the audience as a conversation. And the conversation was, should Donald Trump be allowed back on Facebook and Twitter? This was when he was unbanned. And for me, someone who's not a particularly big fan of his, but I thought it was outrageous that he got banned off those social media platforms. Because he was at the time a sitting president of the United States. How can you ban a sitting president from the public square, essentially? That's ridiculous. So I made that point, and there was a woman sitting next to me, some kind of politician, who said, no, I believe we must have the strictest rules about things that are said online, and we must have maximum safety. And I was like, well, why don't you go to North Korea then? They have a lot of safety when it comes to the internet. right? People seem to have forgotten that that is the sliding scale that you're operating on. You can have more safety, but then you will have a lot less freedom. And to me, that is just an antithesis of the Western idea, of the entire thing, of the Western project, which is built on the idea that we are free and we're free to do research and make technological breakthroughs that will actually solve many of these problems. And I think the pandemic is a perfect example of this, because we in the UK now have we have excess deaths that we do not know where they're coming from, right? That are at a much higher level because of the things that we did during the lockdown, right? And countries like Sweden that pursued a much less restrictive policy on these issues, they don't have the same excess death rate. So we may find out actually that our policies around the response to COVID may in the long run have harmed more people than they saved. And that's why the pursuit of safety by sacrificing freedom often will actually be counterproductive. And what you've find is you've sacrificed freedom and you didn't actually get the safety you were hoping for either.